Ayn Rand was a woman who escaped a communist dictatorship, built a philosophical system from scratch, wrote two of the most influential novels of the 20th century, and became one of the most read and most hated intellectuals in American history. She did all of that without a movement behind her, without a collective identity, without asking anyone's permission. And yet, if you asked most modern feminists today what they think of Ayn Rand, the answer would be swift and dismissive. She internalized the patriarchy. She was a tool of capitalism. She doesn't count. Here's the paradox. Woman who arguably lived the most radical version of female independence in 20th century intellectual life is rejected by the very movement that claims to champion female independence. How does that happen? What does it tell us about modern feminism, and what does it tell us about Ayn Rand? That's what this video is about. Not a political attack, not a culture war soundbite. A philosophical examination. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why Rand would reject modern feminism. Not out of hostility to women, but out of an uncompromising commitment to something modern feminism has quietly abandoned: the individual. Stay with me. This one goes deep. Before we analyze Rand's critique, we need to understand who she actually was, because most people who dismiss her have never seriously engaged with her life. Ayn Rand was born Elisa Rosenbaum in St. Petersburg, Russia, in 1905. At 12 years old, she watched the Bolshevik Revolution swallow her country whole. Her father's pharmacy, everything he had built, was seized by the state, not borrowed, not taxed, taken, because the collective decided it had a right to what an individual had created. That moment didn't break her. It radicalized her in the truest sense of the word. It drove her to the root of the question: what is the relationship between the individual and the state? Between personal achievement and collective demand? She taught herself English. She got out. She arrived in the United States in 1926 with $50 and the kind of ambition that doesn't ask for permission. Hollywood. New York. 2 decades of grinding, writing, being rejected, rewriting, and then The Fountainhead in 1943, Atlas Shrugged in 1957. Millions of copies. A philosophy she called Objectivism: reason, individual rights, rational self-interest, and productive achievement as the highest moral purpose. Now here's what matters for this conversation. Rand never identified as a feminist. Not once. But she also never accepted the idea that being a woman was a limitation, a disadvantage, or a collective identity that defined her obligations. She had a decades-long career in a field, philosophy, that was almost entirely male. She didn't campaign for a seat at the table, she built her own table. She wrote Dagny Taggart, one of the most capable, ambitious, unapologetic female protagonists in American literary history, at a time when most fiction was still writing women as wives, victims, or supporting characters. She fell in love with a married man and conducted that affair openly and rationally, or at least she believed she did, without shame and without apology, because she considered her choices her own moral business. Was she perfect? No. Was she contradictory at times? Absolutely. But the picture that emerges is not a woman who internalized oppression. It's a woman who refused to define herself by oppression at all. And that refusal, that philosophical core, is precisely where her collision with modern feminism begins. Before Rand's critique lands, it needs to earn its weight. That means we do something most culture war content refuses to do. We take the strongest version of modern feminism seriously. Not the Twitter caricature. Not the most extreme fringe. The actual substantive case. Because if we're going to apply Rand's philosophical lens honestly, we have to start where she always started, with reality as it is, not as we wish it were. So here's the Steelman case for modern feminism. First, the historical grievance is real. For most of recorded history, women were legally classified closer to property than to citizens. They couldn't own land in their own name, couldn't vote, couldn't sign contracts, couldn't attend most universities. In the United States, a woman couldn't open a bank account without her husband's signature until 1974. These weren't cultural preferences. They were legal structures enforced by the state that systematically prevented women from acting as sovereign individuals. From Rand's own framework, that is a direct violation of individual rights. Full stop. Modern feminism emerged in large part as a response to those real, concrete, institutionalized violations. And in that original form, fighting for equal legal standing, equal rights before the law, equal access to opportunity. It was doing exactly what a rational, rights-based philosophy would demand. Rand herself acknowledged this. She supported a woman's legal right to abortion. She had no patience for traditional conservatism that kept women in domestic roles by social pressure or legal force. On those foundational points, early feminism and Rand were pointing in the same direction. Second, systemic patterns don't require conspiracy to be real. You don't need a secret cabal of men plotting against women to acknowledge that certain patterns in hiring, in institutional culture, in how ambition is perceived differently depending on gender, exist and have effects. A rational person can look at data, observe patterns, and ask, what are the causes and what are the solutions? That's not victimhood. That's epistemology. That's exactly the kind of clear-eyed analysis Rand respected. Third, solidarity isn't inherently collectivist. People who share common experiences sometimes find it useful to organize around those experiences. That's not automatically a rejection of individualism. Workers forming a union to negotiate wages, women advocating for legal reforms, minority groups pushing for equal protection under the law, these can all be understood as individuals pursuing their rational self-interest through voluntary association. So the Steelman case is this: modern feminism, at its foundation, is a response to real injustice, informed by observable patterns, pursued through voluntary organization. Taken at face value, that's not obviously incompatible with Rand's framework. So where does it break down? Where does Rand look at modern feminism? Not the 1848 version, not the suffragette movement, but the dominant intellectual current of 2024, and say, this is not a defense of the individual. This has become something else entirely. That's where we're going next. 4 specific points of rupture. 4 places where modern feminism, in Rand's philosophical court, loses the case. Rejection 1. Group identity over the individual. Here's the first place Rand draws the line, and it's the deepest one. Modern feminism, in its dominant 2024 form, is built on a foundational premise: that women are a class, a collective, a group with shared interests, shared oppression, and shared political obligations that flow from that membership. You've heard the language: women's issues, the female experience, solidarity. As a woman, you should. And embedded in all of that language is an assumption Rand considered philosophically catastrophic: that your group identity is morally prior to your individual identity. That being a woman tells us something meaningful about what you value, what you owe, how you should vote, what positions you should hold. Rand called this kind of thinking collectivism, and she considered it not just politically dangerous, but epistemologically corrupt. Why? Because it inverts the proper relationship between the individual and the group. Groups don't think. Groups don't act. Groups don't have rights. Only individuals do. A group is an abstraction, a mental shorthand we use to identify certain similarities between individuals. The moment you start treating the abstraction as the moral primary, as the thing that determines what a specific person owes or deserves, you've committed what Rand would call a category error with catastrophic consequences. Think about what this means in practice. Sarah is a 34-year-old software engineer in Austin. She built her career through 12-hour days, continuous self-education, and a refusal to let anyone tell her the field wasn't for her. She has specific values, specific goals, a specific philosophy of life she's developed through her own experience and reasoning. Modern feminism looks at Sarah and says, as a woman, your primary political identity is your gender. Your interests are the collective interests of women. Your solidarity is owed to the group. Rand looks at Sarah and says, Sarah is Sarah. Her identity is her own mind, her own values, her own choices. The moment you reduce her to a gender category, you've erased the most important thing about her. This isn't a minor semantic disagreement. It's a fundamental clash about what a human being is. And Rand would say modern feminism, despite its stated commitment to female empowerment, actually disempowers women by making group membership the primary lens through which a woman should understand herself. You cannot champion the individual while simultaneously demanding that individuals subordinate their identity to the collective. That contradiction is not a bug in modern feminism's operating system. Rand would argue it's the feature. Rejection 2. Victimhood as a moral currency. The second rejection cuts closer to the psychological core. Modern feminism has developed, over decades, through academic theory and cultural practice, a sophisticated moral framework built around victimhood. The logic works like this. Oppression creates moral authority. The more you've been harmed by a system, the more your voice carries weight, the more your claims are presumed valid, the more others owe you deference, resources, and accommodation. Suffering in this framework is not just a condition to be overcome. It's a credential. And Rand would consider this one of the most psychologically destructive ideas in modern culture. Not because suffering isn't real. It is, not because injustice doesn't exist. It does, but because building your identity and your moral standing around your victimization does something corrosive to the human spirit. It makes your wounds more valuable than your achievements. It creates a perverse incentive structure where the path to moral authority runs through demonstrated helplessness, not demonstrated capability. Rand wrote in The Virtue of Selfishness, "Do not hide behind the fallacy that you are fighting for the freedom of others." And she was equally sharp about the inverse. Do not build your identity on the claim that others are responsible for your condition. This isn't cruelty. It's the opposite of cruelty. It's a refusal to accept a framework that keeps people psychologically imprisoned in their own grievances. Consider Marcus. He grew up in a genuinely difficult environment, real disadvantages, real obstacles, real unfairness. Two paths open to him. Path 1. He makes his victimization the center of his identity. Every setback confirms the narrative. Every achievement is qualified by what the system still owes him. His moral standing comes from the ledger of what was done to him. Path 2. He acknowledges the difficulty, refuses to let it define him, and builds his life through his own choices and effort. His identity comes from what he does, not what was done to him. Rand's entire philosophy is a sustained argument for Path 2, not because Path 1 isn't understandable, it is, but because Path 2 is the only one that actually produces a human life worth living. Modern feminism, in Rand's court, has institutionalized Path 1. It has made victimhood not just a temporary condition to be overcome, but a permanent identity to be maintained, because the moment you're no longer a victim, you lose the moral currency the framework depends on. That's not liberation. Rand would call it a new cage, one that women built for themselves, with the best intentions and the worst philosophical foundations. Rejection 3. Collectivist justice vs. individual rights. The third rejection is where philosophy meets policy, and where Rand's framework produces its most uncomfortable conclusions. Modern feminism's theory of justice operates on a group level. Injustice is measured by disparities between groups. Justice is measured by the equalization of outcomes, or at minimum, the aggressive redistribution of opportunity across those groups. Pay gaps, representation quotas, affirmative policies, preferential frameworks. The entire apparatus of what's now called equity, as distinct from equality, rests on this foundation. The argument is intuitive. If a group has been systematically disadvantaged, then correcting that disadvantage requires systematic intervention on behalf of the group. Rand's response is precise and unsparing. Justice is not a group-level concept. It is an individual-level concept. Justice means each individual gets what they have earned, not what their group is owed, not what a historical ledger says their demographic deserves. What they, as a specific person, have produced, achieved, and merited through their own choices and actions. The moment you administer justice at the group level, you inevitably commit injustice at the individual level. Here's how. Jennifer applies for a senior position at a technology firm. She's qualified, genuinely, substantively qualified. But the firm, operating under an equity framework, has already determined that this role needs to go to a candidate from an underrepresented group. Jennifer isn't hired. Was Jennifer treated justly? By the group-level framework, yes. Her group has historical advantages that must be counterbalanced. By Rand's framework, absolutely not. Jennifer is not her demographic. She is Jennifer. She is responsible for her own choices, not for the choices of people who share her gender or race. Punishing or disadvantaging her for the sins of a group she belongs to is a violation of her individual rights, full stop. But the injustice runs in both directions. Consider the candidate who does get the role through an equity framework. Rand would ask, what has this actually communicated to that person? That they earned it, or that they were given it? And what does being given something, rather than earning it, do to a person's sense of their own competence and dignity over time? Rand believed that genuine self-esteem, The kind that's durable, the kind that actually sustains a person, can only be built on genuine achievement. The moment you introduce the doubt, did I earn this, or was I selected for my demographic? You've undermined the psychological foundation of real confidence. Group-level justice doesn't just violate individual rights in the abstract. It corrodes the very self-respect it claims to build. Rand would defend one standard applied consistently to every individual regardless of group membership. Not because the playing field has always been level, it hasn't, but because the solution to historical collectivism is never more collectivism. It's the principled, consistent application of individual rights. Rejection 4. Resentment as a political engine. The fourth rejection is the most psychological, and for Rand, perhaps the most damning. Look closely at the emotional engine that powers much of modern feminist discourse. Not all of it. But the dominant current, the one that drives the loudest voices, shapes the academic frameworks, produces the cultural narratives, runs on a specific fuel: resentment. Resentment toward men. Resentment toward existing power structures. Resentment toward women who don't share the framework. Resentment toward achievement that happened outside the approved narrative. Resentment toward anyone who questions the premises. Rand had a very specific and devastating analysis of resentment as a psychological and political force. She called the philosophy built on it the morality of the looter, and she dissected it across hundreds of pages of fiction and philosophy. Here's the core of her argument: resentment, as a sustained orientation, as a political identity, as a moral framework, is the psychology of someone who has given up on their own capacity to create value. When you genuinely believe in your own ability to build, achieve, and produce, when you have what Rand called a producer's psychology, your primary orientation is toward your own work. You're focused on what you're creating, not on what others have. Resentment only becomes your primary orientation when you've, consciously or not, accepted a premise that the game is rigged against you so thoroughly that your own effort cannot determine your outcomes. And here's the trap: that premise, once accepted, becomes self-reinforcing. If nothing I do can change my position because the system is designed against me, then there's no point in the kind of sustained, disciplined, focused effort that actually builds a life. Instead, the rational strategy becomes demanding redistribution, taking from those who have, because the system that let them have it was illegitimate anyway. Rand would say modern feminism has, in its dominant form, sold women this premise. And in doing so, it has committed, with the best of intentions, a profound betrayal. Because the women who most need to believe in their own capacity, the women facing the most real obstacles, are the women most likely to be handed a framework that says, your obstacles are not challenges to overcome. They are proof that the game was never yours to win. That's not empowerment. That's despair dressed in political language. Think about Elena, a first-generation college student, brilliant, determined, working 2 jobs to pay tuition. She arrives on campus and is immediately immersed in a framework that tells her the primary story of her life is one of systemic oppression, that her ambition exists in spite of forces designed to crush it, that the appropriate response to her situation is solidarity, resentment, and collective political action. What does that framework do to the internal fire she arrived with? Rand would say it is the single most effective way to extinguish it. The producer asks, what can I build? The resentful asks, what do I deserve? Those are not just different questions. They produce different human beings, different lives, different outcomes. And Rand would argue that a movement genuinely committed to female flourishing would spend far less time stoking the second question, and far more time teaching women to live inside the first. So Rand rejects group identity. She rejects victimhood as moral currency. She rejects collectivist justice. She rejects resentment as a political engine. That's a lot of rejection. But here's what separates Rand from a simple contrarian. She never tears down without building something in its place. Her philosophy is not a philosophy of no, it's a philosophy of instead. So what would Rand actually defend? What does a genuinely Randian vision of female empowerment look like? 4 things: clear, concrete, uncompromising. First, radical individual sovereignty. Rand would defend the absolute, unconditional right of every woman to be the author of her own life, not the author of women's lives, not a representative of her gender's collective interests, the author of her specific, singular, irreplaceable life. That means the woman who wants to be a CEO and the woman who wants to raise 6 children at home are both making sovereign choices that deserve equal philosophical respect, provided those choices are genuinely hers, made by her own reasoning, free from social pressure in either direction. This is where Rand would part ways not just with modern feminism, but with traditional conservatism simultaneously. Both, in her view, try to tell women what their choices should mean. Modern feminism says domesticity is capitulation. Traditional conservatism says career ambition is unfeminine. Rand says, both of you get out of her way. What matters is not the content of the choice. What matters is the sovereignty of the chooser. A woman who freely, rationally chooses a life that looks traditional is not a victim of patriarchy. A woman who freely, rationally chooses a life that looks radical is not a threat to social order. She is, in both cases, a human being exercising the faculty that makes human beings human. Reason applied to her own existence. Second, achievement as the only legitimate moral credential. Rand would defend a world where what you do, what you build, create, produce, achieve, is the only basis on which you claim moral standing and social recognition, not what group you belong to, not what you've suffered, not what historical forces operated on your demographic, what you specifically have done. This sounds harsh in an era saturated with sensitivity to disadvantage. But Rand would argue it's the most generous framework available, because it's the only one that treats every individual as fully capable. When you tell a woman her moral standing comes from her victimhood, you are, whatever your intentions, communicating that she is fundamentally defined by what was done to her, that her identity is reactive, not generative. When you tell a woman her standing comes from her achievement, you are communicating something entirely different. You are capable of creating value. Your actions matter. Your choices determine your life. Rand would say the second message is not just philosophically correct. It is psychologically life-giving in a way the first message can never be. Third, equal rights, not equal outcomes. Rand would defend, with absolute consistency, the principle that every individual, regardless of gender, deserves identical legal standing, identical protection of rights, identical access to opportunity. Not identical outcomes, not proportional representation, not corrective preferences. Identical rights. The distinction matters enormously. Equal rights say, the rules apply the same way to everyone. Equal outcomes say, the results must match a predetermined demographic distribution. Rand would argue that the moment you pursue equal outcomes, you have necessarily abandoned equal rights, because engineering outcomes requires treating individuals differently based on group membership, which is precisely the violation of individual rights that justice is supposed to prevent. This is not comfortable. It means acknowledging that equal rights don't guarantee equal results, and that the gap between them cannot always be closed by policy without creating new injustices. But Rand would say, an uncomfortable truth is still a truth, and a comfortable injustice is still an injustice. Fourth, voluntary association always. Rand would defend the right of women, or any group, to organize, advocate, and associate voluntarily around shared interests. What she would not defend is the transformation of that voluntary association into a moral obligation. The demand that all women must identify with feminism. That departing from the framework is betrayal. That solidarity is compulsory. The moment belonging to a movement stops being a choice and becomes a duty, the moment dissent is treated as treason, you have left the territory of individual rights and entered the territory of collectivist coercion. Rand's version of female solidarity, if we can even call it that, would look like this. Individuals who share certain values and interests, choosing freely to work together toward goals they've each independently determined. Serve their rational self-interest. No guilt, no obligation. No, as a woman, you owe. Just free individuals, reasoning clearly, acting on their own judgment. That's what Rand would defend. Not a softer feminism. Not a reformed feminism. Something philosophically prior to the entire debate. The individual woman, fully sovereign, fully responsible, fully capable, as the only unit of moral analysis that matters. Everything we've discussed so far has been philosophical architecture. Now let's talk about the human beings standing inside that architecture. Because Rand didn't just theorize about female strength. She wrote it. She lived it. And the portrait she left behind, across her fiction, her philosophy, and her own biography, is one of the most demanding and most liberating visions of womanhood in modern intellectual history. What does the strong woman look like through Rand's lens? She doesn't perform strength. She exercises it. There's a version of female empowerment that's become culturally dominant, and it's largely aesthetic. It's about projection. Confidence as branding, assertiveness as a social signal, power poses and carefully curated self-presentation. Rand had no patience for this. The strong woman in Rand's imagination. Dagny Taggart, running Taggart Transcontinental, Dominique Franken in her brutal, uncompromising clarity, doesn't perform capability. She is capable, and the difference is everything. Dagny doesn't spend her days asserting that she deserves respect. She runs a railroad so competently that respect becomes unavoidable. Her strength isn't claimed, it's demonstrated. Daily, through work, through judgment, through the refusal to accept a lower standard of performance from herself than she would accept from anyone else. That's the first mark of Rand's strong woman. Her credibility comes from her competence, not her identity. She takes full ownership of her choices, including the hard ones. The strong woman in Rand's world doesn't outsource accountability. She doesn't explain her failures by reference to systems, structures, or the obstacles her demographic faced. She looks at her own choices with clear eyes and asks, "What did I do, and what should I do differently?" This is not a denial that obstacles exist. Dagny faces plenty of them. Men who underestimate her, a world actively collapsing around her, a brother who is everything she is not. She acknowledges every obstacle with total clarity. And then she acts anyway. Rand's strong woman doesn't wait for the environment to become fair before she begins. She operates on the premise that her choices are the variables she controls, and she controls them with everything she has. This is what Rand means by moral agency. Not the freedom to succeed in a perfectly just world. The freedom and the responsibility to act on your best judgment in this world, with all its imperfections, and to own the outcomes. She knows what she values, and she doesn't apologize for it. One of the most quietly radical things about Dagny Taggart is not her competence. It's her unapologetic clarity about what she loves. She loves the railroad. Not abstractly, viscerally, specifically, with the kind of passion that most people reserve for relationships. She loves the sound of a well-running engine. She loves the logic of a well-designed system. She loves her work in the way that Rand believed all human beings should love their work, as an expression of their highest capacity. And she never apologizes for that love. Never minimizes it. Never performs ambivalence to make others comfortable. Rand's strong woman knows her values the way she knows her own name. And she organizes her life around them, not around what she's supposed to value, not around what her group has decided matters, but around what she, through her own reasoning and experience, has determined is worth living for. This is what Rand called integrity, not the social virtue of being honest with others, but the deeper virtue of being honest with yourself. Of living in alignment with your actual values rather than performing the values your environment demands. She chooses her relationships, she doesn't submit to them. Rand's vision of romantic love is controversial. It's also deeply misunderstood. She wrote passionately about love, but not the self-sacrificial, duty-bound love that conventional morality celebrates. She wrote about love as the response of one's highest values recognized in another person. Dagny doesn't love Hank Rearden because she needs him, or because love is her obligation, or because her group identity demands a certain kind of partnership. She loves him because she sees in him the same fierce commitment to work, reason, and integrity that defines her own life. Rand's strong woman doesn't choose a partner to complete herself. She doesn't choose a partner out of fear, social pressure, or the biological panic of a ticking clock. If she chooses a person whose values she genuinely admires, and she walks away from anyone whose values she doesn't, without guilt, without apology, without the need for the relationship to validate her existence. This is what Rand called the traitor principle applied to love. You offer the best of yourself, and you accept nothing less in return. Not as cruelty, as self-respect. She is neither the victim feminism imagines nor the homemaker traditionalism demands. Here's the synthesis. Rand's strong woman doesn't fit neatly into either of the dominant cultural narratives about women. She's not the oppressed, solidarity-owed, systemically disadvantaged collective member that modern feminism sees. She's not the nurturing, domestically oriented, biologically defined figure that traditional conservatism idealizes. She is something both frameworks find uncomfortable. A fully realized individual, sovereign, rational, productive, unapologetic. She doesn't need a movement to validate her choices. She doesn't need a tradition to contain them. She needs only her own mind, her own values, and the freedom to act on them. That woman, that specific, irreducible, non-categorizable human being, is what Rand spent her entire life defending. Not women as a class, not women as a cause. Women as individuals. And that, Rand would say, is the only defense of women worth making. So here's the verdict. Ayn Rand would not reject modern feminism because she was indifferent to women. She would reject it because she took women too seriously to accept a framework that reduces them to a class, arms them with victimhood, and runs on the fuel of resentment. She would reject it the same way she rejected every collectivist ideology she encountered in her life, not with contempt for the people inside it, but with philosophical precision about where it goes wrong and what it costs the individuals who embrace it. The cost is not abstract. Every woman who builds her identity around her oppression pays a price in the currency of her own potential. Every woman who waits for systemic correction before she fully engages her own capacity is spending days, real, irreplaceable days, that her own life will never return. Rand's verdict is not women don't face real challenges. Her verdict is, you are too valuable, your mind is too powerful, your choices are too consequential to spend your one life waiting for the world to become fair before you begin. The practical frame. 3 questions. If you've watched this far, here's what I want you to walk away with. Not a political position, not a team to join. 3 questions to sit with. 1. Where in your life are you defining yourself by what happened to you, rather than by what you are building? That's not a judgment. It's an honest inventory. Rand would say the answer to that question is where your real work begins. 2. Are the frameworks you've adopted about women, or about any group you belong to, actually expanding your sense of what's possible for you specifically? Or are they quietly contracting it? A philosophy that genuinely serves you should make you feel more capable, more sovereign, more focused on your own work. If it primarily makes you feel more aggrieved, more owed, more dependent on external change, Rand would say, examine that framework carefully. 3. What would it look like to pursue your goals as if your own choices were the primary variable? Not denying the obstacles, not pretending the playing field is perfectly level, but operating from the premise that your judgment, your effort, your decisions are the most powerful forces in your own life. That's not naivety. That's the psychology of the producer. And Rand spent her entire life arguing, through her fiction, her philosophy, and her own example, that it's the only psychology worth having. If this video made you think not just about feminism, but about how you see yourself and your own capacity, hit like. It tells the algorithm this kind of content is worth spreading. If you know someone who would benefit from this perspective, share it. Not to start a fight. To start a conversation. Subscribe to the Rand Lens, because every week we take the ideas that shape modern life and run them through the clearest philosophical framework ever built. And if there's a topic, a movement, a cultural debate you want me to analyze through Rand's lens, drop it in the comments. I read them. I'll see you in the next one.